For its ultimate purpose, the Ukrainian armed forces took striking steps in the Crimean Peninsula, which is defined as the heart of the war. Regions such as Kharkiv, Svatov, Crimea, Bakhmut, Zaporizhia, Mariupol, or Kherson are, of course, very important for both sides of the war. But for the Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin, the common answer to this question is the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea's dependence on water supplies from mainland Ukraine and the importance of the naval base in Sevastopol make the peninsula the key to the war. So who holds the key to the war now? Technically, Crimea is currently a Russian-controlled territory. The attacks on the Russian annexed Crimea in August shook the Kremlin. The Russian military presence in Crimea was shaken by a heavy attack, and the headquarters and airports of the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet were severely damaged. Crimea, Putin's red line, was no longer inviolable. Many Russian military assets and navies in Crimea have been attacked dozens of times over the past months. The military consequences of this situation were, of course, enormous for Ukraine. The Russian Navy had completely lost its air dominance in the Black Sea. However, the main purpose here was the socio-psychological effects of these attacks, and the large-scale attacks on the Russian military presence in Crimea achieved this. It's estimated that there are between 40,000 and 70,000 Russian troops in the Crimea. The attacks caused a psychological collapse while disturbing the Russian soldiers in many ways. During this process, Russian officers sent their families from Crimea to Russia, while the effects of the attacks on the Russian soldiers were in this direction. The effect on the Russian people in the Russian Crimea was much more severe. Until August, more than 1.5 million Russian citizens lived in Crimea, but now that Russian military assets in Crimea have been subjected to an 11-month series of serial attacks, the Russians have tried to flee to Russia in panic, anxiety, fear, and turmoil as a result of attacks on Sevastopol, on Koyarmyansk, and even the city of Krasnodar near Crimea. The peninsula is preparing for a massive mass exodus. Although Moscow has implemented calming policies to prevent the escape of the inhabitants of the peninsula, thousands of Crimean residents have already sold their properties and started to implement their escape plans. Most of the thousands who left Crimea are relatives of Russian soldiers fighting on Ukrainian soil. These people think that Russia will eventually lose the war. Escape routes from Crimea have already been determined. When we look at which way the Crimean residents prefer to leave the peninsula, we come across several logical options. The best way to escape from Crimea seems to be the Kerch Bridge at the moment, but the number of people fleeing the peninsula has increased so much that the Kerch Bridge is now completely locked. There was thousands of kilometers of traffic on the bridge. The traffic jam at the entrance to the Crimean Bridge from Russia recently increased to 13 kilometers, according to the information received. The approximate waiting time at the Kerch Bridge is up to 5 hours. The situation is getting worse. So many refrigerators have been installed at the entrance to the bridge. Those waiting in traffic get water from these cabinets. Despite all these negative conditions, thousands of people are still trying to escape from Crimea. Although the queue of traffic on the Kerch Bridge is increasing day by day, people don't give up on waiting for this queue. International intelligence reports and some Russian sources share critical assessments that there will be a major attack on the peninsula. In fact, the increase in the density of Ukrainian partisan groups in Crimea is a harbinger that something will happen on the peninsula. Experts suggest that at a time when the counter-offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces in the southern part of the front is starting to gain momentum, the Russians are afraid of Ukrainian sabotage on the bridge. Actually, it's pretty accurate. All vehicles are checked at the bridge entrance. Russian authorities in Crimea are probably trying to prevent sabotage groups from taking any action on the peninsula. All suspicious vehicles caught under control on the bridge are stopped and questioned by the Russian authorities on the peninsula. In addition, eyewitnesses are posting videos of a massive blockage of cars that were unable to cross the occupied peninsula and hindered due to inspection procedures organized by the Russian authorities. After the videos were posted on social media, Russian authorities on the peninsula claimed that these were routine checks so as not to escalate the incident. But such videos are causing the people of the peninsula to panic even more, leading to a record increase in evacuations, according to Crimean Transport Minister Nikolai Lukashenko at 9 a.m. on July 1st. Traffic on the Kerch Bridge stretched by 5 kilometers and the waiting time to cross the bridge was more than 2 hours. Crimean Transport Minister Lukashenko also reported that additional workers were sent to the control line on the bridge and control over their work was strengthened. These statements by Nikolai Lukashenko actually reveal the whole reality in Crimea. Controls are being increased for peninsula residents who want to flee. But Russian authorities in Crimea are trying to delay evacuation as much as they can, considering where the most suitable escape point for the inhabitants of Crimea is. Many military experts and war analysts speculate that this place may be Krasnodar. The residents of the peninsula also chose to cross the Sea of Azov and reach the Russian city of Krasnodar in order to get rid of the psychosociological effects of the war immediately. For this reason, in addition to the Kerch Bridge, the piers in Crimea are also very crowded. Residents of Crimea leave the peninsula by ferry from these piers. Some go to Krasnodar, others wherever the ferries take them. In other words, the goal is only to escape from the Crimea. It is now thought that in the past 11 months, about 20% of Russians in Crimea have fled to Russia. Even ethnic Russians who are residents of Crimea from time to time, that is, those who resided before 2014, migrate by selling their 70 to 80-year-old houses and lands. There are now strong signals that the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing for the Crimean offensive. As of this week, the Ukrainian armed forces have launched an offensive against Russian military assets on the left bank of the Dnipro to liberate the peninsula. Ukraine carries out airstrikes on Crimea almost daily. Russia's only choice in this regard is to increase the defensive fortifications on the peninsula. However, since the peninsula cannot be covered with a shield, the Ukrainian army can target Crimea at any time with long-range missiles. But the inhabitants of Crimea were leaving their order behind and leaving the peninsula due to possible attacks by the Ukrainians. After 2014, mostly Russians settled in Crimea, and Putin, who took the majority of the population, has ruled this region for a long time. The Russian population in Crimea is around 1.5 million, and half of this was settled in Crimea after 2014. Now, according to this data, the Russian population in Crimea is still around 50%. But before the Ukrainian attacks, it was around 60%. 2.5 million people live in Crimea. Russians are the ethnic group with the highest density at 60%. However, as it can be understood from here, approximately 250,000 Russians left Crimea. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's chief representative in Crimea, Tamila Tasheva, announced that if she retakes the Black Sea Peninsula, she will face the evacuation of 500,000 Russians from Crimea. The statements of Ukraine's Crimean official fell like a bomb. On the agenda, Tasheva stated that approximately 500,000 to 800,000 Russians currently live in Crimea legally and could be forcibly deported in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and international law norms. Over 2.5 million Russians live in Crimea, and as a result of Ukraine's pressure on Crimea, about 250,000 Russians have fled to Russia. If 800,000 Russians living illegally in Crimea were deported from the peninsula, more than 1 million Russians would have left Crimea. The Crimean Tatar leader and regional experts predict that at least 500,000 more Russians may leave the peninsula by the end of the summer. Groundbreaking days continue to be experienced in the Ukraine war, while the sudden long-range attacks of the Ukrainian army added a different dimension to the war. The Russian front lines began to collapse. Dozens of Russian command posts, arsenals, and airfields were targeted by the explosions in the Russian-occupied Mariupol, Berdyansk, Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. In recent days, especially with the United Kingdom's delivery of Storm Shadow short-range ballistic cruise missiles with a range of over 250 kilometers to the Ukrainian armed forces, the war has moved to a completely different dimension in favor of Ukraine. The inclusion of Mariupol in the Great Offensive Plan initiated by the Ukrainian armed forces on the Donetsk front lines drew all the attention to this region. Attacks are increasing in Mariupol, the land corridor between Crimea and Donbass, and tensions in the city are rising. This week, an incredible offensive operation took place in Mariupol with long-range cruise missiles. This attack was a critical step towards the liberation of Mariupol. Powerful explosions were heard in the suburbs of Mariupol and near the airport the other day. After these explosions, it was reported that there were attacks in the airport area. Local residents posted a series of videos featuring the powerful explosions. The explosions were so strong that the sounds of the explosions made the city groan. After the explosions, fireballs rose into the sky. The flames were huge enough to be seen from all over the city. Despite the darkness of the night, explosions shook the Mariupol region. Initial reports indicated that the Mariupol airport where Russian troops were based had been hit. According to available information, the missiles were launched from the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine and flew to the area of the old city airport of Mariupol. The huge missile salvo from 250 kilometers to the Mariupol airport, one of the main headquarters of the Russian army, made the Russian generals very nervous. In the shared video, it was understood that the explosions in Mariupol were quite violent. Therefore, it's thought that the Russian forces suffered a great deal of casualties as a result of the attacks. First of all, Petro Andriushenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, confirmed these attacks. Andriushenko also shared a video of an explosion near the Nevsky residential complex recently built by Russian forces. In the video shared by Mariupol City Council, huge black smoke clouds and the explosion behind residential buildings attracted a lot of attention. Petro Andriushenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, noted that the Russian air defense was not able to repel the attacks. A few hours before the explosion, Petro Andriushenko reported that Russia had shifted helicopters from Berdyansk to Mariupol. Presumably, the Russian plane was moved to the airport area where the attack took place. Also, some sources claim that old barracks may become targets. However, at the moment, there are no details yet from the regional leadership. Although it's not specified with what weapons the attack was carried out, there is an official evidence that Storm Shadow cruise missiles could have been used because Mariupol is located beyond the 70-kilometer range of the HIMARS and M270 rocket launch systems that Ukraine received from the West. As previously reported, the UK has confirmed that it has supplied Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles to Ukraine. The declared operational range of this cruise missile is more than 250 kilometers. These explosions in Mariupol also destroyed views of Russian domination in the city. So how is life in Mariupol, and why are the people there leaving the city and rebelling against Russia? Last year, Russian bombardments damaged or destroyed more than 90% of the city. In addition, Russian attacks cut off access to electricity, heating, fresh water, food, and medical supplies in Mariupol. This created a humanitarian disaster in Mariupol from Russian forces. Local officials say that more than 20,000 civilians have died in the city. These figures constituted a huge damage to the city. Ukrainian officials explained that about 100,000 civilians remained in Mariupol, where before the war, about 430,000 people lived. About 330,000 civilians left the city. Mariupol harbor and train stations had become common escape points for civilians. Now the city hosts less than 100,000 residents, and their situation is critical. The remaining population density of the city consists of the Russian army of about 50,000 soldiers. In other words, this city has been seriously affected socio-economically and psychologically. On the other hand, last month, Ukrainian missile and artillery units launched a massive attack on the port of Mariupol. Heavy artillery and machine gun explosions were heard in Mariupol harbor. In this operation carried out jointly by the Kiev missile and artillery units, the port city was exposed to heavy artillery fire. The violent sound of the attacks was also heard by the inhabitants of the city of Mariupol. Petro Andriushenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, announced the Ukrainian attempt to attack in Telegram. According to Andriushenko, 6 months ago, this area was used by the Kadyrovites for educational purposes. In addition, no official statement has yet been made about casualties and damage as a result of the attack. The smoke screen over the Mariupol port attack has not been lifted. Russian authorities refrain from giving detailed explanations about the incident. Also in mid-March, at least 15 explosions took place in 10 days around Mariupol. Among the areas caught in the blast are 2 Russian ammunition depots at the airport in Mariupol, 2 fuel depots, Russian military bases, and the port area. So why is Mariupol still so important to the Russians? Why is Russia still afraid of losing the city? The Russians focused on Mariupol to create a land corridor between Crimea and the east and to paralyze the Ukrainian economy by blocking exports in the besieged port. As is known, Mariupol was largely devastated at the beginning of the war. However, it is still important for Russia because it's the largest city that Russia captured in 2022 and currently controls. And it's also on a very important logistics route. On the other hand, Mariupol is important for securing a land corridor between Crimea and Donbass. Mariupol has been a strategically important port on the Sea of Azov, part of the Black Sea. It is the largest port for the Azov Sea region with its deep piers and is home to an important iron and steel factory. In normal times, Mariupol is Ukraine's major exports hub for steel, coal and corn to customers in the Middle East and beyond. In other words, the Russian leader wants to put the Ukrainians in an economic bottleneck. Mariupol, on the other hand, was home to a Ukrainian military unit called the Azov Brigade. If Russia managed to capture a significant number of Azov Brigade fighters alive, it would likely expose these fighters to the Russian state-controlled media as part of an ongoing information war to discredit Ukraine and its government. But so far, this aim of Russia has not been successful because the Azov Regiment is still actively continuing the liberation struggle of Ukraine on the southern lines of Bakhmut. As a result, Mariupol put up fierce resistance. But look at the price. The city was destroyed largely in ruins. The places that Russia eventually bombed and bombarded, which will go down in history along with Grozny and Aleppo, turned them into rubble. In other words, the Russian armed forces, especially the Russian leader Vladimir Putin, almost stripped the city out of life with the invasion operation they planned. But the Ukrainians continue to resist no matter what. And as we mentioned, the recent attacks of the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol have already become a symbol for the liberation of this city. Now, many Ukrainians are more optimistic about the future. The majority of EU member states and those who think that Ukraine's freedom is justified, such as the USA, started to work for the reconstruction of Ukraine. In this regard, the EU plans to use frozen Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine. If you remember in the statement made by the presidency of the European Council of Sweden, it was stated that an EU working group would be established to use the frozen Russian assets for the reconstruction of Ukraine. In the statement, it was stated that the said working group will conduct legal, financial, economic and political analysis on the possibilities of using frozen Russian assets in the reconstruction of Ukraine. And it was emphasized that the study also aimed to obtain a clearer picture of where the assets belonging to the Russian state are located and their total values. In short, the foundations for the reconstruction of Ukraine have already been laid. The main purpose now is seen as the end of this occupation of the Ukrainians and the re-establishment of peace. Apart from the new developments in the Zaporizhia region, a number of very important events took place in the Kherson region. Here, the Russians once again leveraged their positions on the islands to engage their artillery from a very short distance and quickly hide. However, today the deployed Russian artillery units were caught red-handed and successfully destroyed. As you remember, in the aftermath of the retreat from the western bank of the Dnipro River, the Russians retained control over most islands. One of the most problematic islands for the Ukrainians turned out to be the island Veliky Potyomkin. The reason why it caused a lot of trouble for the Ukrainians is twofold. Firstly, this is probably the most populated island on the Dnieper River Delta, excluding the island within Kherson city's administrative borders. Even though it looks empty, the outer part of the island has thousands of houses, so the area where the Russians can hide and establish their positions is really vast. Secondly, this island is extremely close to many Ukrainian positions, including Kherson. The island part of Kherson is only 1.5 kilometers away from the Russians. Other villages such as Belozerka, Dniprovsky, and Berehov are around 3 to 6 kilometers away from the island, and all the settlements are constantly suffering from shelling. Especially Kherson, where residential buildings become the target almost every day. Forcing the river to assault and push the Russians out of it was extremely risky and difficult. So the Ukrainians decided to establish tight sniper and artillery control. Over the last month, the Ukrainians were able to collect all the necessary information to simplify their counter-battery actions. They identified approximate time windows that the Russians usually used and rough coordinates of their positions. The day when the Russian artillery unit was conducting yet another fire mission, the Ukrainians timeless spotted the unit, adjusted the coordinates, and transferred them to the artillery units that were waiting for the possible immediate need for counteraction and fired at the Russians. Since the artillery duels took place between short-range artillery systems that are located a maximum of 6 kilometers from one another, it is almost impossible to timely reposition if your enemy has been waiting for you, which is why the Russian artillery unit operating in this region was destroyed. The locals also reported explosions in Alaska. The Russians are using this town as one of their main prefrontal bases, so the Ukrainians likely targeted the area of Russian forces concentrations. In the meantime, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that in the aftermath of their precision strikes that happened over the last 2 days, the Ukrainians fixed the arrival of dozens of trucks at the hospital in Novokakhovka with wounded personnel. Finally, when it comes to the Zaporizhia region, more details became available about Russian plans when it comes to the villages to the west of Orikhiv. As you remember, the Russians established control over the gray zone area and attempted to attack Step Over. Unfortunately for the Russians, the attack seems to have failed. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that they were not only crossing the fields, but also attacking uphill, which is extremely difficult. A similar situation happened near Sherbaki. Today, the Russians adjusted their plans and assaulted Kamiansky, which is located in the lowlands. The fights here are very tough as the Russians are fixed in Ukrainian troops by firing at them from the opposite side of the bay while another group is storming their flanks. When it comes to the area east of Orikhiv here, the setting is completely different. Unlike in the western area where the Ukrainians have small fortifications on the hills here, the Ukrainians have big fortifications in the lowlands because these fortifications are well developed. The first wave of attacks has been repelled, but because these positions are in the lowlands, it is much easier for the Russians to continue storming them. That is why I expect the clashes here to continue. Overall, the Russians failed to achieve any progress by assaulting Ukrainian positions in front of Orikhiv because here the Ukrainians have a lot of tactical advantages positions. That is why the Russians are expected to shift their focus to the outskirts where they can move along the valleys.